Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Let's go and take a look at The 13th Hour by Trudie Skies. So The 13th Hour, Book 1 in the Cruel Gods by Trudie Skies is an SPFBO8 finalist, so whichever way you look at it, that's some really high praise. This year I'm going to be reading all 10 of the SPFBO finalists as part of Cassidy's alternate SPFBO final, and I'll leave a link to the blog for that in the box below this video, so you can go and check that out and see all the different reviews that the 10 of us have put in for these 10 titles. It would be an untruth to say that that's the reason I picked up The 13th Hour though. I read it before it was announced as an SPFBO finalist, or at least I started it. I can't remember exactly where I was in the book or if I'd finished it when that finalist announcement was made. But this is a title that a number of people have recommended to me, even knowing that it's not the sort of book that I would normally pick up. They still thought it might be something that I could enjoy. And it was a book that I was definitely intrigued in. I also read the first chapter as one of my recent first chapter reads videos, and I'll link that up in the cards in the top corner. And I quite enjoyed it. I was intrigued enough from that first chapter to want to pick up the book and continue reading it. So first things first, I listened to the audiobook for this, and one way or another that might have skewed my experience with it, but we'll get to that in a bit more detail when I talk about the audio later on. First though, I've already said that this isn't the sort of book that would normally be considered my cup of tea. It's a gaslamp fantasy, it's set in a steam-powered city, there's a very definite steampunk vibe throughout the book, so it's a level of technology that's a bit more advanced than what I normally look for in my reading. Here we have 12 domains, and each of them are very different settings, although we don't really see much of those throughout the book itself. Each of these domains has its own people though, and they all have very different kind of looks and personalities, and to a certain degree capabilities as well. So it's a very varied world, and although we don't visit the domains ourselves in the book, people do move between domains, so we do get access to a lot of the different races during our reading. If you visit the author's website, which I'll link below, there are descriptions of all the different domains and their peoples, including artwork, so you can really visualise the differences between the people we meet. There are also individual character studies, so you can get a bit more of an insight, including visual cues to some of the main cast of the story. So I found this setting to be a very interesting concept, as well as the 12 domains, each of which are the purview of their own individual god. You also have the aforementioned steam-powered city, which is called Chime. This is kind of a hub for this world, and it's the setting for the book itself. There's a portal here that allows you to move between the individual domains, but it's on a 12-hour cycle, so if you miss the crossing to your intended domain, you have to wait another 12 hours before that crossing will open up again. Chime itself is a very varied city with a defined upper, middle and lower layer, and this is one place where the gods can't tread, so people from all different domains are able to mix freely, although they have to remain faithful to their individual gods as they do so. So overall the world building is very well done. There's clearly been a lot of time and a lot of effort put into this, and as far as the story goes, I think it works very well. The characters are not really defined by their domains. The ones that we get close enough to, that we spend enough time with, all have their own personalities and their own motivations, and in general the interactions between the different characters I thought was very well done. There were a few instances where I thought the character work was maybe just a little bit too much for my own personal taste, but of course I can't really say too much on that here because of spoilers. Our main characters of Kale and Quen though worked well, even if I feel like they would never really work well together under normal circumstances. This story of course is just not normal circumstances, so they're thrown together and I think they do well from the situation. As a diviner, Quen has the ability to manipulate time, and I think that can be a very difficult thing to write because it can lead to the character becoming overpowered, and it can lead to everything becoming just a little bit too easy. But I think it was well handled here, and it didn't cause a problem with that at all. The specifics around Kale, which I can't really go into for spoiler purposes, similarly could cause problems, but I think it was well handled here, and although it was maybe a little bit convenient now and then, it didn't cause a problem. So back to the audio then, because I feel most of this relates to the character aspect of it. I started out quite enjoying the audio. When I was at the start of the book, it was going along quite nicely. I thought it was quite a good narration. And as I sometimes do find actually with audiobooks, as I started getting through and towards the end of the story, I started to fall out with the narration a little bit. A couple of the issues I have with the book as a whole might stem from my experience with the audiobook, but of course it's impossible to tell whether that would be the culprit or whether I would have had the same issues if I was reading it on my Kindle or in physical form. Firstly, the voices in general started to grate on me just a little bit towards the end of the book. As the story ramped up and some of the dialogue became a little frenetic, I found there was a big variation in a few too many places in the volume of the narration, and with some of the voice acting in those circumstances, along with some of the language used, I did find myself cringing and reaching for the volume button a little bit when I was listening to this with other people in the house, especially because I've got a 7-year-old daughter and there was a fair amount of swearing in the book as well. The second part of this is because it's a story told in the first person. We've got two main characters, each narrating their individual part in it. There were no indications though at the beginning of the chapter as to whose point of view we were going to be in for that particular chapter, and the voices themselves were insufficiently varied for me to be able to tell by voice whose head I was in. So it did take a little while in some chapters before I was able to tell whose point of view I was actually reading or listening from. So those two factors definitely made me feel like I might have preferred reading a physical or digital copy of this, but of course, as I said, you can never tell if the experience would be the same consuming the book in a different format. And as it is, I ended up appreciating a lot of the book, but not necessarily enjoying it as much as I'd hoped to. So I'll get into some of the specifics of that a little bit more in my weighted ratings, but as far as the overall kind of enjoyment, the overall gut feeling of it, which I go with in my 5-star ratings, I ended up giving this one 3 out of 5 stars because it was a bit of a letdown for me, although I do definitely realise that this isn't my normal kind of pickup, so that has to be factored into that, and you should really take that with the appropriate pinch of salt. The weighted ratings that I'll go into now do allow me to delve into it a little bit more and take out my personal opinion a little bit, which is why I do like including these ratings as well. So for the enjoyment, which is probably the most personal of these aspects, because I didn't have as good a time with it as I wanted to, I ended up giving this one 14 out of 20. There were a few things that I really enjoyed in it, but there were also a few things that I didn't enjoy so much in it. There were a couple of sex scenes in it which were a little bit too cringe for me, but that's me on a personal level. It's not what I generally tend to read, and sometimes if the description is just a little bit too much, it just doesn't work for me. There were a few bits in the narration, as I say, with different characters and different things being said where I really was cringing at the volume that was being used. So as I say, the audio might definitely have changed my overall perception of the book, but I don't know for sure. For the world building, this was definitely one of the highlights. It's such an incredibly detailed world, such an interesting setting. I ended up giving this one 18 out of 20 because I appreciated the work that had been put into it. Everything worked well. There was nothing that really seemed out of place for the setting it was in, so it was a really good job in this aspect. For the characters, I gave 17 out of 20 because again I thought there was a really good job done here. There was a real variation of the characters, and I liked that you could get into the head of some very different personalities and see various other personalities in the characters our main two interacted with. So this category was another of the highlights for me for this particular book. For the plot, I thought it was quite interesting, but it didn't really engross me as much as I thought that it might do. Part of that, of course, may be again down to my own personal preference, where I don't tend to do the steampunk and the gas lamp type of setting, and some of the elements of it therefore didn't necessarily work for me as an individual. But overall, I think that it worked quite well. There weren't too many things that were completely out of the equation and out of the realms of possibility for this particular world. It's just that overall, for me, it was a good plot rather than being a great one. For the writing, I've gone for 6 out of 10. I mentioned there were a couple of little issues earlier on that didn't quite work for me. One of the key ones being that kind of disconnect at the start of some of the chapters where I didn't know whose head I was living in for that particular chapter, so that definitely impacted my enjoyment. Although the writing itself I think technically was pretty good throughout most of the story, there were just a few little niggles for me here and there, but it was mostly on a personal level rather than anything else. The pacing I thought was pretty good for most of the aspects of it. There was a little bit of variation here and there, but nothing nothing too serious, nothing that really caused any real problems, and so I gave this one 3 out of 5. And then for my discretionary category, I've given, again, 3 out of 5 because I do quite like the cover, even though it's definitely not my normal kind of thing, and it definitely tells me that the book within isn't going to be my normal kind of thing. But I've also given a couple of extra points for the amount of additional kind of resources, I guess, that you get with this. First of all on the website, but also some of them within the book itself, where you've got an introduction to the City of Chime and some of its rules, and you've got an introduction to the domains as well. So I think there's quite a lot of additional kind of resource that you can get for this book. So overall, if we go back to my 5-star rating where I gave this one 3 out of 5, that might not seem too great, but the weighted ratings give this one a score of 76%, which I think sounds a lot better and is probably a lot more accurate for the book because it's looking at more the individual elements rather than my own personal feeling on it, based on that knowledge that it's not my usual setting that I tend to enjoy. So as far as the Hall of Fame goes, that puts the 13th Hour in equal 67th, and there's some books in and around that score and that ranking, but I really enjoyed. So that's what I feel is the beauty of these weighted ratings. It looks at the individual elements of a book rather than just relying on how much I liked them. So after the announcement of the SPFBO8 finalists, this is my first finalist review. I have already read 2 of the other finalists and I'll be reading the remaining 7 over the coming months, and you can look forward to reviews for them. As far as this one goes, let me know in the comments down below what you thought of the 13th Hour if you've read it, or if you're looking forward to reading it, what are you looking forward to, what are you expecting from it? As usual, you can find all of my social media and support the channel links in the description box below this video, including my book club Discord and my Patreon. Do come along and take a look at both of those if you're interested in getting a little bit more access and a bit more from this lovely little community that we're building here. I'll hopefully see you in the next video sometime soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.